The thing about the residential schools, the boarding schools, and that whole period of time, especially when it was in its, all its glory, I guess. You think about Carlisle Indian School existing for that almost 40 years, and right up until like the early 1900s. At that same time that Native people were having their identities stripped from us, white people were kind of enamored with the whole idea. L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, he wrote 2 genocide editorials that came out in 1890. One of them was to, in a way, eulogize the Sitting Bull after he was murdered. And what he said was, the last great one is gone. The only thing left to do is to exterminate the remaining, because while he praised Sitting Bull, he thought what we had become in 1890 warranted extermination. He said, why not annihilation? Their glory is fled, their manhood has been effaced. Better they die than live the wretched curs that they are. In later days, we will praise and speak of the glory of the grand kings of the forest and the plain. So this notion that we could be both loathed and loved was a part of American history. Once you wipe us out of a place, then you could reinvent us, reinvent the idea of who we were. That's what where school mascots came from. The idea that hundreds of schools in New York State alone, but thousands across the United States, and colleges and professional sports would take our images, reinvent them, redefine them, create cartoon logos or whatever imagery, mostly trying to depict us as this fierce, noble savage. That would stand up right alongside lions, tigers, and bears. So dehumanize us in a way, but at the same time, create an image that, for all intents and purposes, would turn into identity theft. The most popular mascot across the country was a Native mascot. Used more than any other animal, any other, image or idea. And it would come in the form of redskins and warriors and raiders and savages and Indians, and then every individual name of a people would be used. That's what the mascot issue became. And it's something that I worked on. One of the first places that I worked in a big way on was a suburb of Buffalo called Lancaster. Lancaster, they called themselves the Redskins. And every time the Washington football team would make news with its name, Lancaster would also, from a local standpoint, would be called into question. So about 15 years ago, I got called to be a part of a committee of Native people that was going to educate the school board and the superintendent of Lancaster about why Native people objected. So we participated in what was called workshops with the school board that were open to the public. The news media was curious what was happening, and of course, this gets thrown right into the culture wars of the United States, the right versus the left. And the right's all in favor of using Native people in mascots. The left's always, predominantly opposed to it. So it becomes this, conversation about wokeism and cancel culture and all that other stuff, instead of addressing the actual issue. I think we did a good job educating the school board. But it wasn't just us. One of the things that had happened was 3 of the school districts in this Western New York area, one close to the Tonawanda Senecas, a school district called Akron, one close to the Tuscaroras called Niagara Wheatfield, and one that were some of the kids from this territory, Cattaraugus, go to, Lakeshore. The Native athletes and I think it was primarily the lacrosse teams, the Native athletes stood up with the non-Native athletes, with their parents, with their coaches, and with the school and said, we're not going to compete against Lancaster anymore. We refused to compete against Lancaster as long as they maintain that mascot. They knew it wasn't just a mascot. There was a level of racism, and that's what we saw. Look, while we were going to some of these meetings, there was a few people who were threatened with violence. It was one of them. But it was after these 3 school districts, led by the kids, because the question always is, well, who's really opposed to this? The kids stepped up. That's what impacted Lancaster. The board voted unanimously. Not 6 months down the road like they had originally planned. They were going to phase this thing out over time. Within months of this whole event beginning, this whole conversation beginning, they voted to retire the mascot. So that was over a decade ago. But what I hadn't done was gone to my own high school. I grew up and I went from essentially 3rd grade till I graduated in a school in Cambridge, New York. And they were the Cambridge Indians. My sister and I were probably the first native kids to graduate from that school, calling themselves the Cambridge Indians. But I got to tell you, when I was there, this wasn't this omnipresent and overbearing imagery. Yeah, it was painted on the gym floor. And, the baseball uniform said Cambridge Indians on it. But there wasn't like this obsession with it. Nobody was like, oh, I'm an Indian. But about 20 years ago, a commissioner of education at the New York State Department of Education told schools across the state, his name was Richard Mills, he told schools, you've got to get rid of these mascots. Phase them out, do it in a time that makes sense, that you can phase them out in a time that's practical, is what he said. And that was in like 2000. And of course, many did, but many didn't. And some not only didn't do it, but they actually doubled down and they expanded the use. My old high school is one of them. I mean, the thing about Cambridge, it's out near the eastern part of the state. It's not Plains Indian headdress stuff, But you couldn't ask somebody from Cambridge, so what Indians are you actually claiming to be? They couldn't even tell you. Or Huron? I don't know, or Mohawk? Pequot? I mean, what do you... They couldn't tell you. They don't even know those because they don't teach it. They just use the image. So I went to my school. And 2020, end of 2020, went to my old school. And I formally asked them to retire the mascot. And I gave them the full thing. Everything from residential schools to L. Frank Baum to, what the American Psychological Association had recommended, what every Native organization, including all of the nations, but all the associations and the National Congress of the American Indian. They ultimately agreed that they would make a determination early in 2021. They pushed it all the way off to the end of the school year. They read a resolution that was to retire it, but then didn't vote on it. And by now, one of the board members had quit, and another one was going to be replaced with an upcoming election. So they never voted on the one they read. They came back in 2 weeks, and the compromise resolution failed. So then they went back to the original resolution, and it passed. So it passed to retire, and it was a narrow margin, 3-2 or something like that. And this was in June of that following year. And so that resolution passed. The next month, a new board member was seated. So one of the 3 that voted to retire was gone. So now the power shifted. So they passed a new resolution at the next board meeting to rescind the retirement resolution. So I worked with 5 families in Cambridge, and they petitioned the sitting commissioner of New York State Education Department, Dr. Betty Rosa. They petitioned her to rule against the Cambridge School Board that they had acted arbitrarily and capriciously and had abused their discretionary authority. And she ruled in favor of those families. I had actually even submitted a brief. NYSED, the New York Education Department, has been silent for 20 years. Your silence has to end now. You need to step up. You need to speak up. So I kind of beat her up a little bit. And lo and behold, they did. They issued a statewide ban. Dr. Rosa called me up on the telephone on a Friday night, Friday evening. It was like, wow, this is out of the blue. And she congratulated me, but she also asked me to sit on her Indigenous Mascot Advisory Council, because although the ban was passed by NYSED, it was going to go before the New York State Board of Regents, which is the final say. But they also wanted to create what the regulations were going to look like, how this ban would be rolled out. And so as a representative on this advisory council, I was going to be a part of shaping that. Turns out the Board of Regents voted unanimously to uphold the ban and to issue the ban. The reason that this story is important, it gets back to some of what I've talked about coming up with a plan and a manner of affecting change that isn't the path they've given you. Sometimes you got to create a different way of approaching it. Even those 5 families who had petitioned the Commissioner of Education, when I talked to them, I says, look, I'm not trying to get the Department of Education to issue a ban. They said, well, that's not going to work. They said, you've got to go through the state legislature. I said, there's been a bill sitting in the state legislature for a number of years. It's not moving anywhere. So that was all part of my strategy. So I created a whole different movement in New York State, a state that's not easy to navigate politically. People are just so afraid to address cultural issues because they're afraid of losing their base. And I knew if I did this through the education department, it was a means to achieve something that wouldn't have been able to be achieved otherwise, at least not in New York State. But you can't tell that story about white kids playing Indian without understanding what Native kids were going through at the same time. Because these things were happening at the same time. Most of these schools say, oh, we've been the Cambridge Indians for 60 years. Yeah, you know what was happening 60 years ago? And in the years since then, look, residential schools still existed when I was in school. There are still over 100 residential schools today. They're just not forced. But again, the irony of Native people having their identity stripped while white kids could smear their mom's makeup on their face, beat their oatmeal canisters, and run around and play Indian as a part of school, whether it was on the football field or on the sidelines. That can't be missed. While this ban is in place in New York State, there are still many other states, 8 states total, that have mascot bans. The rest of them still exist. Again, this is the level and an example of racism as it exists that most people are completely unaware of. This should have been an easy thing to, once numbers started rolling out of Canada for the amount of grave sites that they were finding, and all of the conversation about residential schools, you would have thought that any school with any kind of moral obligation would have said, yeah, we shouldn't really be doing this.